Hello and a warm welcome to the CNBC Africa special debate. I'm Bronwyn Nielsen. Now, on an annual basis, the World Economic Forum releases a comprehensive report of the state of global competitiveness. On the show today, we'll be unpacking the results of the newly released report for 2014-2015, taking a closer look at findings from an overall Africa and a more focused SADC perspective. Joining me in studio to share their insights, Yunus Suleman, Chairman, KPMG, Dr. Precious Moloi-Motsepe, Co-founder and Vice Chairman of the Motsepe Foundation, and Bernard Agulhas, the CEO, Independent Regulatory Board for Auditors, or IRBA, and Bonolo Ramokhele, a member of the WEF Global Shaper Group and chair of its Johannesburg Hub. And joining us from London, the lead economist and head of global competitiveness and risks for the World Economic Forum, Margareta Drzeniek. And we're also joined by a studio audience this afternoon. Of course, we do want to encourage tweets into the conversation, hashtag WEF Global Comp. I'll repeat that as hashtag WEF Global Comp, and we welcome your comments and questions coming through to the studio. Let's quickly kick off now with Margareta in London. Thanks very much for your time. Margareta, we're very excited to be getting a first-hand account on the Global Competitiveness Report. And I suppose we've got to start with the objective of the overall report from your perspective, knowing that it began in 1979, covering some 16 countries at this point, and then moving forward to 148 last year and 144 the 2014 and 2015 report. So perhaps just before we get a little bit of context, why we've gone from 148 last year to 144 this year.
Yes, we have the reduction in the number in the country coverage is actually due just simply to our inability to collect quality data from those countries that we were not able to include, and actually a number of African countries are affected. So we were not able to include Liberia, Benin, but also Brunei Darussalam, and Ecuador and Bosnia and Herzegovina. And we reinstated Tajikistan. So it's more of a technical issue that we were not able to collect the data in those countries. That's why we had to reduce.
Now that we've got that out of the way, the overall objective, let's go back to that. In terms of what the World Economic Forum is hoping to achieve with this report.
What we hope to achieve with this report is to motivate reform in the first place. And in order to achieve reform, we obviously need public-private collaboration. So we use this report as a platform for public-private discussions at our meetings and also at different venues in the countries that we cover, in order to identify those strengths and weaknesses that those countries need to address or that they can build on in order to strengthen their competitiveness going forward. And for us, competitiveness is really about productivity and about how productive an economy is, meaning about how well it uses its resources and how well it operates. Productivity in turn is what determines long-term economic growth. So in the end, the report is about those factors that drive prosperity of a country over the next 10 to 15 years.
If we look at the top 10 competitive economies, are there any major changes, shuffles taking place, or are we seeing some stability in the top 10? We need to know from an Africa perspective, because we've got to ascertain who we're chasing once we sort out some of the problems on the continent.
Well, we see stability on the very top. So Switzerland remains on the top for 6 consecutive years. 6th consecutive year, and Switzerland is characterized by a number of strengths that make its economy very, very productive. It's highly innovative. The collaboration between businesses and universities and the public sector is very good. The institutional framework is very strong. Macroeconomic stability is very high, and we also see a very flexible labor market that's operating in Switzerland. So there are a number of factors that make it very highly competitive, especially also in the European context. It's followed by Singapore, which has very strong institutions, very good infrastructure, also very good education systems. So these are the strengths that make up Singapore. And then the country that's moved up, not the most, but the most noticeable movement in the top 10 is the United States, which moved up from 5th last year to 3rd. And we see rarely actually big moves in the top 10, and that's why this improvement in the United States is particularly welcome, because it could mean that the United States is indeed recovering strongly from the crisis. We see improvements in business sophistication and innovation in the United States, which points to some initiatives that may be taking ground. And we also see that some of the institutional variables are improving. For the remaining countries, we do not see much movement. The top 10 are dominated mainly by European economies, mainly Nordic economies actually as well. So we see further down Germany in the rankings as well at 5th. We see also Finland at 4th, we see Sweden at 10th, we see Japan moving up slightly to 6th position this year, Netherlands and Hong Kong. So we have a good set of top 10 most competitive economies, which are dominated by Nordic European countries.
Margareta, now that we've established that, let's enter the African story. And where are we going? Talk to us about the movers and shakers on our front.
Well, in Africa, what we see from the overall Africa perspective, we see first of all huge differences between the best performing Mauritius at 39th and the poorest performers, which is Guinea at 144th, and actually the poorest performing country in the sample, in the entire sample. So we look at a continent that's by no means homogeneous. There's huge heterogeneity between the different countries, and this is also reflected in the competitiveness performance. So we see considerable competitiveness divide. At the same time, the issues that most of the countries are facing are in a way repetitive. So we see that infrastructure is a topic that keeps coming up as a weakness. We see that human capital issues, education, skills, preparing people for the workforce, ensuring that they have the right basic skills but also the more advanced skills is a challenge across a number of countries. Maybe one nice story that is worth highlighting is Mauritius, which is the best performing economy in Africa.
I just want to jump in there, Margareta.
For a couple of years.
In
Mauritius,
Margareta, just in terms of giving a little context around Mauritius, the super performance from the 2013-2014 report, where they were ranked 45, now moving up to 39th position, as you mentioned just a moment ago. So please continue your train of thought on Mauritius.
Yes, so Mauritius has moved up last year, but we also see a very positive trend over the past 6 years, where it moved up over 20 places in total. So over a number of years, we saw a very positive trend in Mauritius. The past improvement was mainly due to improvements in institutions, so a reduction in corruption, more efficient bureaucracy, more efficient judiciary, this type of aspects, and also in terms of goods markets efficiency, where the country has improved somewhat over the past year. So Mauritius is really the star performer in Africa on the competitiveness index. And the next country that is actually noticeable is the drop of South Africa by 3 places as well. It's mainly due to the fact that it's being overtaken by other countries, so it's not improving fast enough this year.
And again, just to put the context around that, Margareta, just to put the context, South Africa having gone from 53rd position in the prior report to now 56th position. Yes. I think other countries worthy of mention, just to bring in that East Africa and West Africa context, Kenya gaining in traction, having gone from position number 96 to 90, so positivity on that front. Rwanda continues to be one of the star performers. It is still the third most competitive economy on the African continent, and it's leapt in the global rankings from 66 to 62. Any further commentary on East Africa before we touch on Nigeria?
No, I think it would be worthwhile to spend some time in Nigeria.
Well, Nigeria, we are looking at...
So Nigeria, what we see in Nigeria...
120 to 127, so we've backtracked from a Nigerian perspective, and I'm sure you're going to share your concerns on that front.
Yes, we have indeed backtracked on the Nigerian perspective, and what we saw in Nigeria is that this was driven in particular by the deterioration in the macroeconomic environment. So the oil revenues were less strong last year in Nigeria than in previous years, and this has increased the budget deficit in the country. So this was a major reason why the country has dropped the 7 positions. So quite a large decline actually indeed, from 120th to 127th. We also see rising security concerns in Nigeria, which were reflected in the survey of business executives. So the situation around the north of the country, around Boko Haram, and the security concerns that this places on the business community, and the challenges it places in terms of increasing cost of protecting security in the country is an ongoing concern that is rising in Nigeria.
Margareta, thanks for that input. Obviously, Nigeria is key to the Africa story, being now the largest economy on the African continent. Thank you very much to Margareta Drzeniek, the Director, Lead Economist and Head of Global Competitive and Risks at the World Economic Forum, joining us from London. Let's move to our discussion point. And Yunus, picking up from what Margareta was saying, that this report is hopefully able to kickstart public sector, private sector engagement to meet tangible results. Do you think we're starting to see that happen?
Absolutely. I'm actually a member of a committee called Beyond Advocacy at Business Leadership South Africa. So from a business point of view, we're coming forward and making an offer to collaborate with the public sector. So I think that's a great start. I think the other comforting point is that this report recognizes that Africa has significant growth rates at 5%, which is a huge positive spin for this continent. But I think there's definitely an upside that can come in terms of value-adding activities, because I think the infrastructural challenges in Africa brings our competitiveness down. And we need to focus on that going forward to help us to really improve on the rankings. It is unfortunate that two of the largest economies have slipped a number of spaces. But I definitely think there's potential to improve our competitiveness globally.
Precious, you are also a member of the Global Agenda Council on Africa. You'll be meeting in Abu Dhabi later this year, hopefully to address or help to address some of these problems from a collaboration perspective. Do you think that we are in a position where we can make tangible differences on the ground? I know that the Motsepe Foundation is involved in education projects, widespread education projects at the grassroots level.
Well, thanks, Bronwyn. Firstly, I want to commend the World Economic Forum for this survey and for the report. I think its importance in helping us focus on competitiveness of our countries, of our economies, is crucial, because at the end of the day, why they do this exercise is to ensure that countries prosper, that the wealth within countries is shared equally, that there is inclusiveness, and that people feel that their lives on a daily basis have improved, the living standards are improved. But having said that, I also want to point out to a fact that was raised by the lady herself, that we're such a vast continent with, and we're so diverse in our populations, in the way we do business, in the sectors that actually drive. Exactly, yes. And one could argue that the way the survey is done brings in a lot of perceptions. I mean, the fact that Nigeria has done so badly because of fears, so it's perceptions, and there's a lot of subjectiveness that comes into the reports. That's just one area that I wanted to bring to bear. In terms of what we do going forward, it is important, yes, that the private sector, that business, that civil society, as well as government come together in a collaborative effort to ensure that what needs to be done in different sectors trickles down to improvements in people's living standards.
Bernard, let's bring you in here, and I'm sure that Yunus is going to share in the celebration. I hope you are getting all the auditors in the country out for celebration. Number one, gentlemen, strength of auditing and reporting standards globally, and that is a position I think that we have held firm for 6 years. This is the 6th year. Celebrate. What are we doing? What are you gentlemen doing right? Bernard, perhaps you'd like to offer us some thoughts there.
Thanks, Bronwyn. I think we must remember that most of the benefits that we also receive from or in achieving that position comes from the interdependencies with some of the other pillars, although we might not be doing so well in the other pillars.
You mean you're not going to take all the glory for yourself?
No, there are also some other pillars that do contribute towards our achievement. But I think very, very importantly is that there's different factors that contribute towards us getting to that position. It's not just one single thing that we've done. And if you take some of the factors mentioned in the report, like innovation, from a standards perspective, South Africa has been very innovative, and we've been thought leaders in a lot of areas. So that's just one of the areas that can move us from the efficiency a position where South Africa might be now, to an innovation position, which is the next best position that we can find ourselves in. There's also the fact that we've accepted global standards or adopted global standards in 2005. And the report specifically talks about the openness between markets. And the moment you open the markets and you've got one set of standards that everybody understands, it immediately creates that confidence in our financial markets. And by creating that confidence, you can increase investment in the country, you can improve education and create employment, which is something that we should also be focusing on. So it's just some of the examples. When you look at our education model, we have been trying to be responsive to the changing demands out there, which also is a factor in the report. As the demands on auditors change, we have changed the competency requirements for auditors, for example. And in responding in those ways, we have been meeting the criteria that the report measures. So it's a lot of factors that come together and get us to that position.
So we go from number 1 to dead last on the quality of maths and science education. Now, you are a qualified chartered accountant. Perhaps, Bonolo, we can get you to weigh in with your opinion on these dramatic results from an education perspective. Quality of our education system, 140 out of 144. And I just also want to give some context. I'm focusing now on South Africa being the largest economy within SADC. We will touch on Mauritius and the bright spot a little later, but I thought we could actually drill down in the detail into South Africa because they will be bearing for the rest of the Southern African development community.
Thanks for having me, Bronwyn. I think that we need to also look at the education scenario within context, because we inherited an education system that was twofold, a superior education for the white minority and an inferior education for the black majority. And those things have actually manifested into the current education system. Where
we can't bridge the gap.
We can't bridge the divide. And what you actually get is that this historical dividend bears out actually in the classroom as well, whereby you've got teachers in the townships and in the villages who have been taught under a Bantu education system and can actually do the teaching in certain areas. And some of the work that we do with ABASA and so forth, when you go out to schools in the rural areas in Eastern Cape, KZN, Mpumalanga and so forth, you actually sit with the teacher who can't teach. And it also doesn't help us that we've got mathematics literacy, which pretty much is a bit inferior compared to mathematics that other kids are actually learning all across the world. And this is an issue in that incentives also come into play. A school, for example, will force students to actually do maths literacy because it looks better in terms of the pass rates in matric, and that keeps the education, what you call education department, off the principal's back. So you've got all of this, and we've also got a scenario whereby access to education is improving, but the type of access that we're actually giving our students.
Pressure again. I don't know if it's improving quickly enough. Yunus, let's come back to you on the education. I think we must stay here for a while because, as Margareta was highlighting, this is one of our key weaknesses. We understand the legacy issues, but it's not an excuse. We have got to fast track our youth. And Margareta made another very valuable observation, is that there is such a gap between what is being taught and the business skills that are required by corporates within this country, that we can't bridge that gap as well to get people to move into a viable workforce environment. Your contribution?
Well, first of all, from an IRBA point of view, we're absolutely delighted we're number 1 once again. And I think that importantly is that despite the shortcomings in the education system, I think the South African chartered accountants and the registered auditors are sought after globally. And I think that's a major factor that contributes to our global ranking as number 1 in the space. When it comes to education, there are a number of initiatives, both from the private sector and the public sector, and one of them is the National Education Collaboration Trust, which was formed late last year.
And using Lasana.
Yes, and that's driving, bringing business together to pool our funds and ensure that we make a greater impact. And I think that's going to bring the results in a few years' time, but I think there's a greater focus in that. And there's also, let's say, when you talk about literacy, it's just coincidentally on Monday, the 8th of September, is Literacy Day. And I think there's a lot of focus in that area as well in terms of making sure that students are competent or they're actually skilled up in this space. But education is the primary focus of most foundations out there. And, you'll agree with that the Motsepe Foundation will probably also focus a lot on education. And that's what's happening.
Precious, let's pick up on that, because you also mentioned the word collaboration, government, business and civil society working under the Motsepe Foundation on projects in education. Perhaps you can just give us a little more colour around some of those projects.
Well, firstly, what you mentioned about the mismatch between skills and what is available in the job market is very important, particularly now for us with such a huge youth population that is unemployed. So at that level, what we do is to assist young people get skills that are relevant, that will make them employable. Secondly, what we do also is to focus on entrepreneurship for young people, youth entrepreneurship, as well as entrepreneurship for women. And how we do this is we bring in the foundation itself. We work with people, local communities. We work with government, the likes of the Department of Trade and Industry, and we also bring in private sector such as banks and other businesses that are interested. And what we do is we identify businesses that are very importantly sustainable and businesses that have the capacity to create more jobs in the community. At the academic level, what we do is we focus on those sectors, those departments that we know would contribute towards a growing economy and competitiveness in our country. And these being your STEM studies, you know, science, technology, engineering, medicine. And we try and find young people who are interested in these subjects, not leaving out the arts, by the way. We find young people who are interested in these sectors, and we take them to university. We currently have about 400 students that we funding through university as the foundation.
You mentioned STEM skilling. It's going to be a key focus of the Summer World Economic Forum in China next week, which CNBC Africa will be attending. And just to put this into context globally, Obama's administration is putting $3.4 billion into STEM skilling, into those sectors, the science, the maths and engineering, and doing that in a blended environment and preparing people with practical skills for the workforce, which is what you are saying. In the absence of a public sector representative, you're going to have to face the next black spot for South Africa, I'm afraid, Bernard. And that is something that we have been speaking about at the World Economic Forum continuously for the last couple of years. And that is the cooperation in labour-employer relations, where we are again dead last at 144 out of 144. And hiring and firing practices, we are at 143 out of 144. Now, this is also something that's got a lot of attention for South Africa, is our inflexible labour policies. What are your thoughts there?
As the report mentions, under the different pillars, it's important that you've got to get those the different factors that are considered in getting to our ranking, that you have a look at those specific issues. And if labour does not, labour practices do not improve, then clearly it must affect productivity in the country. And we've got to, I mentioned earlier that all these factors are interdependent. So once you can improve the labour practices and the laws and try and avoid the situation that we've been facing in the last couple of months, it will have a direct impact on productivity. Productivity must lead to more efficiencies and ultimately to growth. And it's no good trying to improve on some of the factors but not looking at the rest, because they all eventually lead to the growth of the economy and the country. So unless our labour, the public sector involved in having more control over the labour practice in the country, it doesn't matter what else we do, as long as labour is not being used efficiently, they will not contribute towards productivity, and we will never get growth in the country. So it sounds a bit negative, but we also need to look at where the root causes are, where it starts, and if we can address those issues, I think we will move forward more quickly.
Bonolo, what about your opinion as a businessman operating on the ground? How do you perceive the labour regulations, and what impact are they having on your business?
I think that the biggest issue is actually finding the right people, which Precious actually alluded to, is that there is an issue whereby universities and the employer don't actually talk to each other in South Africa, and that actually comes out in the report, because we don't actually fare that well in terms of collaboration between the higher education institutions as well as as the employer. And also on top of that, once you actually have people inside of your company, yes, the hiring and firing is an issue, but productivity has been an issue in South Africa, whereby it's actually been declining from 2008, whereas pay here has actually been going up. So in terms of as a business, you have to appreciate these sensitivities, but we are heavily unionized as a nation. And I think that is actually one of the things that actually brings such a high cost of actually hiring people, firing people. And it doesn't help that you've got this tripartite alliance that actually runs the country, so it becomes a bit more difficult to actually have objectivity in terms of policy making when it comes to labor.
I just want to give a little more clarity. As I said, we're focusing on South Africa as the largest economy within the Southern African Development Community, but there are 15 member countries of SADC, and just to give you an indication of most of the countries actually moved in a positive direction. There are 3 which moved in a negative direction, and namely the Seychelles, which lost almost 12 places, going from number 80 in the 2013 report to number 92 in the current report. South Africa, we've mentioned, from 53 to 56. Zambia also backtracking, and that from a position of 93 in 2013 to 96 in 2014. We're going to a short commercial break. More findings of the 2014-2015 World Economic Forum Global Competitiveness Report when we return. Welcome back to the CNBC Africa special debate. We're focusing on the regional findings of the World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Report for 2014-2015. I'm joined by Yunus Suleman, Chairman at KPMG, and Dr. Precious Moloi-Motsepe, Co-founder and Vice Chairman of the Motsepe Foundation, Bernard Agulhas, the CEO of the Independent Regulatory Board for Auditors, IRBA, and Bonolo Ramokhele, WEF Global Shaper and Chair of its Johannesburg Hub. Just before we move off for education, Yunus, I know that you had some input around employability, general employability of young people out there.
One of the key focus from a business point of view is what we would call youth inclusion. You get graduates coming out of university and complaining that they cannot get a job. So what's been happening is that there's a number of partnerships, and one of those initiatives we spoke about beyond advocacy is about getting these graduates, let's call it experienced enough to be employable. And I think that's something that's worked pretty well. In fact, KPMG also employed 64 graduates at the beginning of last year and placed them in roles that would actually bring about some kind of experience that they could share with that. And then ultimately those employees now are more marketable and are then taken over as employees permanently in the companies in which they worked. So I think that's an initiative which also helps, first of all, the skills upliftment in addition to the academic education, but also to prepare them for the job market more effectively.
If we look at the overall rankings again, and Bonolo, I'll come to you here. We've only got those 3 economies in the top half of the 144. Mentioning them again, Mauritius at 39, South Africa at 56, and Rwanda at 62. I think it's worth focusing on Rwanda for a little time, although it is in East Africa. Lessons that we can actually learn from Rwanda, because it has managed to leapfrog, from over 20 years, transform the economy from a genocide to one of the most competitive economies in Africa.
Thank you. As you said that in '94, around July, they had just come out of a genocide. You had over almost a million people murdered. And what actually followed after that was actually, I think, strong leadership. Although Paul Kagame came later into the fray as president, but what you have seen under him has been extremely strong leadership. And this has actually manifested in a lot of reforms in terms of technology, in terms of safety. And I'd like to actually hammer down on safety, is that you cannot actually have anything as a country if you actually don't have peace and stability. And they actually made sure that the country was safe from what you call warring factions and so forth. And strong leadership, as I said, transparency has been key. I remember when I was in Davos earlier in the year and I was chatting to the economic planning minister of Rwanda, and he was saying that the key thing with Rwanda is that we need to get it done now and get it done fast. If you are sitting there as a citizen, it's easier for you to actually get access to the president, to a minister, and actually sort out things as soon as possible.
And a highlight there is that it takes 6 hours to open a business in Rwanda. And just by comparison, one of our weak spots again is the burden of government regulation at 120 out of the 144.
Yeah. And speaking of business, we actually say in South Africa that we are open for business, but Rwanda, based on what they do on the ground, they actually show that they are open for business. As you've mentioned, it's quicker to start a business in Rwanda than in the United States, but also in terms of customs, it's easier to get your goods in and out of Rwanda than in other countries. And most importantly, you look at what they are doing in terms of technology. They're actually investing heavily in fixed line broadband and also bandwidth to make sure that the population has got access to information. And they've got this program whereby you've got 1 laptop per child. So it's actually making sure that you actually bridge the digital divide. Exactly. And
digitizing the economy. Yeah. Let's bring you back in here, Bernard, in terms of your view that government regulation, the burden, the lack of openness of our economy, South Africa and perhaps a number of other economies in the SADC region.
Yeah. Regulation can certainly be a big burden on business and on progress, but I think what's important is that there should be some form of regulation. As a regulator ourselves, I believe that it is the fact that the auditing profession is regulated that may be contributed towards our #1 position. Once any profession is regulated, it just creates that confidence from the public in that profession, and ultimately the confidence in our financial markets.
Agreed that we need regulation, but you also have to agree with me that there is over-regulation in the South African system. Do you agree with that statement?
I do agree with you. That's why I mentioned
difficult for an auditor to admit.
I think we believe that appropriate regulation is how we should describe it. Over-regulation, certainly at the moment, there is over-regulation for auditors specifically, not from the IRBA only, but from various other regulators, and that stifles business. So we need to move from a situation where there's over-regulation and no regulation to one of balanced regulation. And we're not quite there, but I think that is where we should be heading.
We'll take that balanced regulation. Let's aim for that in the Southern African development community. We also need to touch on infrastructure, Precious. It's one of the other weak spots for Africa as a whole, and specifically within the SADC region. You do a lot of traveling across the continent. Do you think that infrastructure is improving? Are we seeing the fruits of the labor on the ground?
If you look at the previous World Economic Forum reports on global competitiveness, they have noted that part of why Africa did so well, probably in the last decade, is because there was an improvement in institutions, there was some form of infrastructure that was built. But the challenge is the infrastructure that was there was not enough and it wasn't maintained. So I do, yes, agree that we do need to focus on improving our infrastructure. It is very difficult to travel from South Africa to anywhere north of the African continent. Firstly, there's visa problems that we have. You almost have to go to Europe to come back to to any part of North Africa because of lack of proper air routes or flights that you can use directly. We do need infrastructure, not just roads, but also the energy. One of the issues that you raised about the Nigerian competitiveness having slided so much could be attributable to the the availability of energy. If you travel to Nigeria, that is a serious concern. And I do believe that for us to become globally competitive, we need to focus on those areas of infrastructure to promote doing good business, to enable us to be able to move our goods and services, but as well as enable us to move people easily throughout the continent.
Yunus, I had sight to some trade numbers in the Global Competitiveness report, and interesting to note that the trade, interregional trade in the Southern African development community lags other trade on the African continent, and certainly it's something that could help boost economic growth within SADC.
That's been a weakness of the continent especially, and even SADC. I think there's been lots of challenges in trying to get open sort of markets where goods can flow between countries quite freely with zero sort of custom duties. But I think that's receiving a lot of attention. And getting back to the question of infrastructure, that's a great starting point to do much more intra-regional trade. If you look at South Africa, we have got huge construction companies that have the capacity to expand and provide their services to other countries within Africa. And I think that will be a great opportunity. And they are already operating in different parts of the continent. but it's about working together and actually converting our raw materials into value-added products. What often happens is products are exported to the rest of the world and brought back as completed products, and that dilutes the actual impact or the value we can gain, and that's increasing the deficit for the respective countries.
In a moment, we're going to open to the audience and take questions from the floor. But Precious, I need to allude to the fact that you are a medical doctor and probably best positioned to answer my question on health and the deficits that we're seeing in this territory. I mean, just looking at some of these stats in terms of a child or infant mortality, 105 out of 144, business impact of HIV/AIDS, 136 out of 144. Again, we're coming back to South Africa as a case in point. Tuberculosis, 143 out of 144. You're doing a lot of work in the healthcare space.
Yes, Bronwyn. You know, we talked about how we can improve competitiveness. I believe that one of the pillars of a competitive society is health. When you have a healthy workforce, you have a productive workforce. So diseases like infectious diseases like malaria, and currently we're seeing what Ebola is doing in Nigeria and other countries where it is rife. These affect the competitiveness of businesses, the ability of people to be productive, and in the end, competitiveness of countries. With South Africa in particular, we did well with HIV in the beginning. I mean, we started off worse, and then we improved in terms of making access available to more people of drugs, treatment for HIV/AIDS. But I think we are sliding again because we're not paying attention to preventative measures.
Off the ball.
Yes, particularly, and therefore you're seeing rampant TB rates, going up, and again affecting our human capital. But the other thing is that we need to pay attention to our women again and young people. When you have healthy women, they give rise to healthy babies. They're able to look after their families and promote health within the family. And it's not just physical health, it's also mental health, which is also a burden on how businesses perform. In terms of, and that's infectious diseases, if you look at the other lurking problem that we're facing, it is in terms of the non-communicable diseases, and these are diseases like hypertension, diabetes, as well as obesity. And these will definitely, we will see long-term effects of those if we don't manage them now.
And look after our human capital. Let's open to our audience for questions from the floor. Go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gugu Sigasa. My question is actually directed to Mr. Agulhas. As a chartered accountant myself, my real concern, or I'm overjoyed that we're doing well in terms of accounting and financial reporting standards, auditing and financial reporting standards. But my concern then becomes, how do we address the gap in the other pillars that we have, that where as a country we're failing? In particular, especially from an accounting professional perspective, is that if today we're not doing well in the maths and science, where mathematics is a foundational requirement to become a chartered accountant, I then worry about where we face, or where our country will be sitting in the next 7 to 10 years when we would be producing our next sort of batch of chartered accountants. So I don't know what your view is in terms of how we can, for instance, be addressing that gap that will have a direct impact then in that, in our good rating in that space.
Thank you, Gugu. I'll respond, try and respond in a positive way by saying that we should, and at a higher level, we should look at why we reach this #1 position for our auditing standards, and use whatever helped us to get to that position to support and assist those other pillars, and see how we can strengthen those pillars or move them up in the global rankings. I mentioned a couple of examples earlier, but if I could just go back to those, what I believe made us successful in our auditing standards ratings are things like being thought leaders, using global standards, opening up the markets, adopting standards that everybody understands. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't respond to local needs and requirements, but it's important that we see ourselves not operating in isolation but operating in a global environment. And if we can apply those principles to any of the other pillars or other sectors, to education, for example, it must also assist in getting those industries to where we are. We've also been responsive, as I mentioned, to labor requirements and labor needs. So if we know what the markets want and expect from us, we need to educate our people. We also need to put them in a position where they can move up the value chain. In the auditing profession, for example, we continuously look at the competence requirements for auditors, and therefore if we can respond to that, we can immediately move them up the value chain as we increase productivity and improve growth in the country. So just a few examples of how we can apply those success factors to other industries as well.
We have another question from the floor.
Hi, my name is Jeff Kemper. I have a question relating to education and some of the people-related challenges. Specifically sort of workplace skills, foundational learning challenges, all the human capital related issues. So if the panel could possibly address how they see technology or formatting technology that's relevant for the African environment and how they see that particular element impacting the way that we can become a more competitive economy and a continent.
Bonolo, I'm passing this directly to you.
Okay. Thank you. I think that without technology, we will not prosper. And I'm biased because we're in the technology space. But in terms of access to information, if you access something on a regular basis, you get to learn on a regular basis, then you actually become a bit better. So in terms of getting kids as early as possible into technology, this means that instead of leaving our kids with the mother on the street and they take care of them and teach them the basics, how about we actually get our kids onto high impact stuff from grade R? And they actually build up with this from an early stage. And also from a perspective of standardized testing, which is thankfully happening currently. So those results, I think, will actually come. They're showing us that our kids are poor in numeracy and literacy from an early stage, so that by the time they hit matric, we've actually plugged that gap. But in terms of technology, I think that the biggest thing is that the government must actually invest heavily.
You want that one laptop per child in South Africa, as per what we're seeing in Rwanda.
Exactly, because one thing that you're seeing in some schools, let's say you go to Tembisa High School, for example, yes, they've got the computers in the school, but they've got no internet. And even if they had internet, you only have access to that for an hour. You need a child sitting at home in Alexander, in Soweto, sitting in front of a laptop that can access Wikipedia, that can access Google, and everything under the sun on a regular basis, each and every day, like other countries are doing, like Korea, Rwanda, the United States, and so forth. And it shows in the output that you're seeing in terms of the quality of education in those countries.
Precious, any comment from you, again, with your work in the education space on digitization of the education?
Yeah, I think it's very important, particularly given what you said about the few teachers per child that we have and the quality of teachers that we also have. It would be very useful then to use internet learning, e-learning for our learners, particularly those in rural communities who are not able to access the type of private schools systems that we have, and have a situation where perhaps, and we do this at my school, private teachers interacting with teachers from the public sector to help skill them up and to also reach learners in the public health system. And it's easier to do that if you're doing it through e-learning. You can reach more people. But technology also is very crucial, again, for health. And we're seeing this in tracking people who are, whether they're taking their treatment, HIV, TB treatment, and just advising people on what to do if they have challenges.
We need to be able to enter the digital world from a competitiveness perspective, otherwise we're going to find ourselves lost. More questions from the floor? Thank you.
Okay, hello. My name is Nizanandi Matri. My question is directed in particular to Dr. Precious Motsepe. Now, I work in the people development space, in the social sector in particular, and we bring foreigners from Europe and the Americas for about 2 months on social impact consulting projects. Now, the challenge, one of our biggest challenges that we face to date is that is overcoming the perceptions that they have about our country, be it in terms of security, health, education, and some of the socioeconomic conditions that are at play here. Now, Dr. Motsepe, you spoke at the beginning about the indirect adverse effect that a forum or a report such as this one can have on the psychology of some of the civilians, looking in particular at Nigeria as your example. How do you propose that our structures or our reporting or our policy inculcates an understanding that changes these ideologies and allows for inter-country communication?
Yeah, that's really challenging one, the issue of perceptions. And I think it is imperative for all of us in the forums that we interact in to continuously educate and change perceptions about our continent. We have come from very far where we were firstly seen as a basket case, and we moved on to a continent that now boasts increasing population, increasing wealth, a huge marketplace. And now we stand to be labeled again as a disease-ridden continent with the recent outbreak of Ebola, as well as the conflicts that are happening on the continent. So I think in your own space, you need to continuously educate, and we need journalists, everybody, to really write the good stories about the African continent, as well as about South Africa that are there, but we don't communicate enough.
Another question?
Thank you very much. My name is Terence Murasiki. I've been asked not to stand because maybe I'm a bit too tall. What I want to ask is in relation with the issue of infrastructure. My feeling being that infrastructure is not always an input. It could actually be an outcome of economic activity, is that you develop further. But then the question is, how do you reconcile the fact that our infrastructure is not exactly adequate with the conundrum that says that when we present the thought that we want to beneficiate minerals as an economy, the very people that must finance that are the customers of the minerals, so they wouldn't have any case to actually help us beneficiate locally. How is it as Africans that we can take ownership in that space? Thank you.
Take us, Yunus?
I think it's about investment. When I had a meeting with the Africa Commission Chair, Nkosazana Zuma, a few months ago, the focus was on infrastructure development, and there's a clear map of what needs to be done across Africa. And it was very concentrated on East Africa. And I think that's where this sort of deficiency is, because if we want to really get intra-regional trade going, we have to connect the whole continent. And I think it comes down to really making sure that there's a complete sort of investment profile that is required. Now, KPMG has a global infrastructure group specifically focusing on Africa. And I think the one thing is that people are investing in Africa because that's where the greatest opportunity for return are coming from. I mean, we all talk about Africa's time has come. It really has come. If you've got 7 of the 10 fastest growing economies in Africa, then surely we can benefit each other. So I think it's a combination of, let's call it the customer and the actual investor working together, because I think it's dictated by how much of iron ore, for example, are you going to ship so that I can invest in the railway line. So it's a kind of collaboration, which we spoke about earlier, that is absolutely critical in working together to get the right infrastructure in place.
You wanted to add it, Bonolo?
Yes, you actually mentioned something that is close to my heart, which is beneficiation. What we're saying something and then we do things that sometimes are contrary to what we actually want to achieve. Ideally, Africa needs to industrialize. But what we are doing, we're spending about 300 billion, let's say, for example, with the Transnet market demand strategy to actually expand our rail network. But our rail network is actually going off to the ports. We're still going to be exporting what you call raw minerals to the world. And I think that we need to take what you call those painful decisions in actually investing heavily in manufacturing facilities, which fine will take a bit more time to actually realize the investment, but those are the type of investments that need to be made. For example, electricity is a big issue. Most mining companies are not putting up smelters in South Africa, they're not putting up plants in South Africa due to the fact that it is extremely expensive to actually beneficiate in South Africa. So I think that a lot more collaboration between business and government, and actually let's try to find a win-win situation in actually alleviating some of these costs to actually industrialize in Africa.
You've now hit on something that I'm incredibly passionate about, and that is energy provision. And just the stat out there is that 7 out of 10 Africans do not have access to electricity. If we use that as a starting point to power the African economy, imagine what that will do for our competitive status. But I won't go on because I could forever on the energy, and I don't want to hijack the debate. We are coming to closing comments, so I'm going to turn to each of you just to get your closing comments on the competitiveness report, perhaps celebrating, as Precious was saying, the positives. Mauritius leaping from 45 to 39. Rwanda, again, moving up 4 points from 66 to 62. What can we learn from them, as we've discussed on this panel? So we have the challenges, because again, South Africa backtracking from 56 to 53, but we still, those 3 economies are in the top half of the 144 global competitive economies out there. Yunus, let's start with you.
I think that ultimately we have got huge potential to improve in the rankings. That is a fact of life. I think if you look at Africa as a whole, we've improved significantly in terms of stability and political, let's call it, environments. So from my perspective, I think when you look at the actual question of the various areas where we're really struggling, it's not complex to really fix it. So if you look at health, for example, it's about communication. For example, lived in Nigeria for 2 years. I got malaria, but it wasn't a big deal because I was educated. I was said, like, if I had any symptoms of this nature, take 3 tablets and you'll be fine. And I think that's what it is. And so with Ebola or any other factors, it's about really educating our communities out there. So once that education is in place, and I think the biggest issue for South Africa is the labor factor and the unrest and the actual Marikana debacle, as well as the fact that you can't hire or fire anyone. So there are fundamentals, and it all comes down to regulation. How can we improve our regulatory environment to make it easier to employ people? And I think that will be a fundamental shift in improving our ratings as South Africa from 56, beyond or below 50, and that will be fundamental for us.
Bernard, remind me, what was the term you used in terms of regulation?
Balanced regulation.
Balanced regulation. We go forth with that as a statement. Balanced regulation is what we are in search of. Precious.
Bronwyn, I think we have made huge strides in the last decade, as I said, in South Africa in particular, in terms of access, universal access to health, universal access to education. What we need to be doing is to making sure that the quality of education and the quality of health that we provide for our citizens is top quality, and we improve in that area. But the other thing I think we need to do is we need to pay attention to our youth dividend and our gender dividend. We need to make sure that we educate young people, get them into the right jobs. We need to make sure that we also bring women into the formal economy.
Bernard.
Thank you, Bronwyn. I think that developing countries must create stronger ties amongst themselves. For example, in Africa, we should replicate the successes that we've had in South Africa in respect of our auditing standards in areas of governance, accountability, reporting, just good governance and regulation, whether it be balanced.
Must be balanced. We don't change that phrase now. We're going with balanced regulation.
And I should use the word oversight. Those practices we've done very well in South Africa. We should replicate those in other countries in Africa and have greater ties. At the IRBA now, we have a specific strategy to share what we have with the rest of Africa. And in that way, we can also become a continent that does well, not just a single country. The other 2 issues where I think we can improve is greater collaboration between industry and universities, for example, as far as research is concerned. And although we say that we've got there's a sufficient collaboration between the private and public sectors, those are still areas where we can improve quite a lot. Like I think Mauritius moved up partly because in the public and private sectors there's more collaboration and trust.
They started talking to one another and really working together.
Exactly, and I think if we can improve on that in South Africa, we'll also do better. Thank you.
Bonolo.
Before I actually get to my thoughts, I think that it's not all doom and gloom. Our auditing standards are quite high up there. Efficacy of our boards, we're in the top 3. Our business schools is in the top 30 in the world. And in terms of regulation of our securities exchange and bonds exchange, we are sitting in the top 3 or so. So it's not all doom and gloom. But overall, I think that not that it's a panacea, but the panacea to our issues is to actually industrialize and actually build really big companies and stop depending on outsiders to actually solve Africa's problems. We really, really need to have our own Apples, our own Dells, our own VWs and so forth, because that is the only way you'll be able to give dignity back to the African people. And lastly, women, women, women. We cannot develop if we're leaving behind half of our population. In any country, there's more women than men. And just to close it off, as the former president of Burkina Faso said, Thomas Sankara, that we don't speak of women's emancipation as an act of charity or benevolence, but it's a necessity for the triumph of any revolution.
Fantastic that you are celebrating women. I also want to borrow from President Paul Kagame of Rwanda, because it sounds as though you've been in his company of late. Africans must solve Africa's problems. I think he has famously said that over and over again. Thank you very much. On that point, we've come to the end of the CNBC Africa World Economic Forum special debate. Thank you to my guests, Yunus Suleman, KPMG, Dr. Precious Moloi-Motsepe of the Motsepe Foundation, Bernard Agulhas, IRBA, and Global Shaper, Bonolo Ramokhele. Thank you as well to our audience and for your interaction. Until next time, it's goodbye and thank you for joining us.